The Dark Scrolls. Anne of Cleves was born on September 22nd, 1515, in Dusseldorf, a town within the modest yet strategically important Duchy of Cleves. In the tapestry of European politics, Cleves was neither a mighty kingdom nor a forgotten backwater. It was a small principality caught between larger forces, the expanding power of France to the west, the Holy Roman Empire to the east, and the restless Low Countries to the north. For centuries, such minor states survived by balancing alliances, by weaving careful networks of marriage and diplomacy. Into this environment came Anne, destined not to shape her world, but to be shaped by it. Her father, John III, known as the Peaceful, was a ruler devoted to law and order rather than conquest. He governed his lands with a steady hand, priding himself on maintaining stability in an age of upheaval. Where others raised armies, he raised courts of justice. Where others sought glory, he sought compromise. His wife, Maria of Jülichberg, brought with her additional territories and noble bloodlines, giving the family influence beyond its small size. Together they raised 4 children: Sibylle, the eldest, spirited and commanding; Anne, quiet and observant; Wilhelm, the heir, ambitious and restless; and Amalia, the youngest, lively and charming. Anne's childhood unfolded not in glittering palaces, but in sturdy castles of stone, filled with tapestries depicting saints and hunting scenes. Life in Cleves was austere compared with the brilliance of the French Valois court or the splendor of Henry VIII's Hampton court. Here, there were no endless masques, no composers crafting madrigals for royal entertainment, no poets reciting verses in candlelit galleries. Instead, Anne's world was practical, orderly, and modest. She learned the duties of household management, how to oversee servants, how to maintain dignity, how to carry herself with modesty and obedience. Unlike the young ladies of England or France, she was not taught music or dancing, nor the art of flirtatious conversation. She could not play the lute or sing a madrigal, and she lacked the witty repartee that kings so often desired in their companions. Yet in her own way she was well prepared, honest, steadfast, reliable, and virtuous. To her family, these were the true qualities of a noblewoman. But to Henry VIII, a man notorious for his restless passions, such qualities would later seem inadequate. Physically, Anne was described as fair-skinned, with light brown hair and gentle features. She was neither dazzling nor unattractive, but her beauty was of the quiet kind, best appreciated over time, not in the first glance of an impatient king. Her eyes, clear and downcast, gave the impression of humility, perhaps even shyness. Her build was somewhat full, not the delicate slenderness that was fashionable, yet she carried herself with dignity. Above all, her demeanor was one of composure. She was not quick to laugh, not eager to dazzle, but steady, calm, and reserved. Her character, too, reflected her upbringing. Anne was not a woman of drama or ambition. She was patient, obedient, and inclined toward simplicity. She enjoyed embroidery, reading devotional works, and managing the small details of household life. She was sincere, sometimes to the point of naivety, and possessed a kind of innocence about the wider world of courts and politics. These traits made her beloved among her family and household, but they also meant she was poorly equipped to handle the treacherous intrigues of Henry VIII's court, where charm and quick wit often meant survival. Europe, during Anne's youth, was a continent in turmoil. The Reformation had begun to tear at the unity of Christendom. Martin Luther's theses had already ignited a firestorm of religious change in Germany. The Emperor, Charles V, struggled to hold together his vast domains against both Protestant reformers and French aggression. In England, Henry VIII had broken with Rome in order to marry Anne Boleyn, creating his own Church of England. The continent was a chessboard, and every royal marriage was a move calculated to secure alliances and strengthen positions. The House of Cleves, though small, was not insignificant in this game. Its territories lay along important trade routes, and its rulers leaned toward the new Protestant ideas without wholly abandoning Catholicism. This made them attractive to those seeking allies against the Pope. Wilhelm, Anne's ambitious brother, saw in his sisters an opportunity. Through marriage, they could elevate the family's standing among Europe's great powers. By the late 1530s, Henry VIII was once again a widower. Catherine of Aragon had been cast aside, Anne Boleyn executed, Jane Seymour dead in childbirth. He had a male heir at last, the young Edward, but he needed another wife, for companionship, for additional heirs, and above all for political advantage. England stood diplomatically isolated, shunned by Catholic powers after Henry's split with Rome. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, sought an alliance with Protestant states of Germany to counterbalance the threat of France and Spain. Thus, the name of Anne of Cleves began to be whispered at the English court. She was of suitable rank, from a duchy aligned with reformist forces and untainted by scandal. For Cromwell, she seemed the perfect solution. For Wilhelm, eager to see his house elevated, the match was equally attractive. Only one obstacle remained: Henry himself. To secure the king's approval, a portrait was required. Travel was slow and costly, and etiquette forbade a casual meeting between prospective spouses. Henry therefore dispatched his court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, to Cleves. Holbein was renowned for his ability to capture likeness with extraordinary precision, but also for his tact. He knew how to flatter without deceiving. Anne, modest and obedient, sat for the painter. Dressed in fine garments, she folded her hands and lowered her eyes. Holbein sketched the curve of her face, the calmness of her gaze, the soft line of her mouth. When the portrait was finished and carried back to England, Henry studied it intently. The woman before him appeared serene, virtuous, and dignified. She was not a temptress, but she seemed wholesome, honest, and respectable. Henry, convinced by the image, declared himself satisfied. In truth, the portrait told only part of the story. Holbein had captured Anne with dignity, but he could not convey her lack of courtly training, her shyness, or her unpolished manners. Nor could a painting convey the spark, or lack of it, that might pass between two people in person. Yet Henry, impatient and trusting in the painter's skill, allowed himself to believe. He accepted the match, and the wheels of diplomacy turned swiftly toward marriage. For Anne, the decision was made without her. She had grown up knowing her duty, to marry where her family commanded, to serve as the bridge between houses. When informed that she was to marry the King of England, she accepted quietly. Perhaps there was fear in her heart, perhaps a faint hope that fortune might smile upon her, but she showed little outward reaction. She prepared herself as best she could for a journey that would take her far from home, into a land whose language she did not speak and whose customs she did not know. Thus, the course of her life was set. From the modest castles of Cleves to the glittering but dangerous halls of the Tudor court, Anne was carried not by her own desires, but by the currents of politics. She would step onto English soil as the chosen bride of a king, her fate sealed by the stroke of Holbein's brush and the ambitions of men. She could not have known that the marriage, meant to secure peace and alliance, would instead mark the beginning of her long tragedy. A tragedy not of scandal or blood, but of disappointment, neglect, and the quiet pain of being unwanted. The winter winds of 1539 carried Anne of Cleves across the sea, away from the modest castles of her childhood, and into the heart of a destiny she had not chosen. She had been told she was to become Queen of England, the wife of the formidable Henry VIII, a man whose name was spoken with both awe and dread across Europe. She had never seen his face, never heard his voice, and yet she was to bind her life to his. To Anne, whose nature was quiet and dutiful, there was no protest. She accepted her fate with calm obedience, as she had been taught to do, though deep within her heart there must have lingered a mingling of nervous fear and fragile hope. Henry, restless as ever, was determined to see his new bride with his own eyes before their wedding, and in his imagination he envisioned a moment of romance worthy of chivalric tales. He rode to meet her in disguise, thinking she would recognize him through instinct, that she would fall instantly under his spell. But when Henry entered her chamber at Rochester, plain and unadorned, Anne did not recognize the King of England. She greeted him with courtesy, but without excitement, treating him as any stranger of noble bearing. For Henry, whose pride demanded adoration, the moment was a disaster. He retreated in anger, muttering to his courtiers that she was nothing like the portrait he had seen, that her beauty had been exaggerated, that he had been deceived. From that first meeting, his heart turned cold. Yet politics had already bound them, and the marriage could not be undone without consequence. On a January morning in 1540, Anne was brought to Greenwich Palace for the wedding. She wore rich garments, her face solemn and composed, her manner calm. She had traveled far from her homeland, she had left everything familiar, and now she stepped into the role of queen. The vows were spoken, the crown placed upon her head, and for a brief moment Anne of Cleves stood as Queen of England. But her husband was a groom in name only. Henry concealed his distaste poorly. That very night, when he should have fulfilled the marriage bed, he came away declaring that he liked her not, complaining crudely to his closest men that he found himself unable to consummate the union. His words spread like wildfire through the court, a humiliation Anne did not even fully understand. She had been raised in modesty, innocent of the games and expectations of the English bedchamber, and she asked her attendants whether all was well, whether she was failing in some hidden way. They could not answer, for the fault did not lie in her, but in the discontent of a king who demanded both beauty and charm, and found neither in his quiet bride. Henry's frustration turned to fury. He railed against Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had arranged the marriage, accusing him of betrayal, even as he sought a way out. Only 6 months after the wedding, Henry moved to annul the marriage. The reasoning was a cruel blow. He declared that it had never been consummated, that he found Anne physically repellent, that she had failed to inspire in him even the faintest desire. To a woman who had crossed seas, who had left her family and home to fulfill her duty, this was a wound deeper than any sword. She was cast aside not for treachery, not for scandal, but for something as shallow and unchangeable as the shape of her body and the reserve of her character. The annulment was swift, and yet Anne met it with extraordinary grace. She made no protest, offered no resistance. She signed the papers, bowed to Henry's decision, and surrendered her crown. In return, Henry granted her estates, jewels, and a generous allowance. Most strangely, he gave her the title of the King's beloved sister. It was a peculiar honor, one that elevated her above nearly all women at court, except his daughters and his next queen. Outwardly, it appeared a gift of kindness, a shield of protection. But beneath its courtesy lay humiliation, for to be named his sister was to be stripped of the intimacy of wifehood, to be denied the dignity of queenship, to be relegated to the limbo of someone useful but unloved. Anne accepted it all with a dignity that astonished those around her. She smiled when duty required. She carried herself with composure. She never spoke against the king. But inside she must have felt the sharp sting of ridicule. The court whispered that she was unwanted, that the king had scorned her, that her crown had lasted less than half a year. Servants smirked behind closed doors, courtiers exchanged knowing glances, and Anne lived with the knowledge that she had become a story of failure. Her humiliation was not only personal, but public, and she bore it with the silence of one who had learned long ago that resistance was futile. And yet, within this humiliation there was a strange kind of mercy. Henry did not hate her. He simply did not want her. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had provoked his passion and then his wrath, or Catherine Howard, who would betray his trust and lose her head, Anne of Cleves remained harmless. She was not dangerous, she was not defiant, she was not a threat. And so she lived. In a court where queens so often met death, survival itself became her quiet triumph, though it was bought at the cost of her dignity. After the annulment, she was sent to the estates Henry had granted her. Richmond Palace, Hever Castle, and other fine houses filled with history and comfort. She was invited back to court on occasion, always treated with respect, often greeted warmly by Henry himself, who joked with her as though she truly were his sister. Mary and Elizabeth, his daughters, treated her with kindness, grateful for the gentle nature she had shown them. Outwardly, she seemed well provided for, her life secure, her position stable. But none of this could erase the truth. She had once been queen, and now she was not. She had left her home to become a wife, and now she was a sister. She had carried the weight of a crown, and now she was set aside like a relic. The contrast became even more painful when, scarcely weeks after the annulment, Henry remarried. His new bride, Catherine Howard, was young and beautiful, full of the charm and vivacity that Anne lacked. The court erupted in celebration, music and laughter filled the halls, and Anne watched from the shadows as her replacement basked in the king's favor. The sight must have pierced her heart. She, the quiet and plain, discarded, while another sparkled in Henry's gaze. She had been the queen for 6 months, and now she was nothing more than a memory of disappointment. History would remember her not as the queen who reigned, but as the queen who was rejected. She became the wife Henry did not want, the woman cast aside, the sister rather than the spouse. For generations her name would be spoken as a footnote, as a curiosity, as an anecdote of royal miscalculation. Yet beneath this cold summary lay a human story of a woman who bore rejection with courage, who accepted humiliation without venom, who survived when survival itself was rare. Still, the wound never fully healed. To be deemed unworthy of love, to be reduced to a sister when one longed to be a wife, to be remembered more for another's disdain than for one's own virtues. These were the shadows that clung to Anne of Cleves long after the crown had been taken from her. She wore her composure like a shield, but behind it lived a sorrow that time could never erase. When the crown was lifted from her head and her marriage dissolved, Anne of Cleves did not vanish from England, but settled into a peculiar new existence. She had crossed the sea as a bride, been crowned as queen, and within half a year been cast aside. Yet, instead of banishment or punishment, she was rewarded with titles and estates, a generous pension, and the strange, ambiguous dignity of being named the king's beloved sister. It was a role no woman before her had held, a mixture of honor and humiliation, for it signified both Henry's affection and his refusal. She was no longer his wife, not truly his subject, but something in between, a permanent guest in a realm that had once hailed her as its queen. Henry, ever fickle, seemed to enjoy her presence after she ceased to be his consort. He visited her from time to time, speaking to her with the casual warmth of kinship. He dined with her on occasion, laughed at her mild humor, and teased her in front of others as though their brief, failed marriage had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. To those who witnessed it, there was a strange intimacy in their exchanges, but one that lacked passion, lacked recognition of what might have been. Anne smiled when required, bowed when expected, and played her part with grace, for she had learned quickly that her survival depended upon it. Her new life was one of comfort and confinement in equal measure. She was given Richmond Palace, a sprawling residence on the banks of the Thames, with wide gardens and gilded chambers. She inherited Hever Castle as well, once the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, another of Henry's wives who had met a far bloodier end. These places were furnished with tapestries, silver, and books, attended by servants who treated her with respect. She was, on the surface, one of the wealthiest women in England, her days filled with ease and her nights secure. Yet the grandeur was hollow. For what is a palace when its halls echo with silence? What is a garden when its paths are walked alone? Anne had no children to anchor her, no husband to confide in, no blood family near enough to comfort her. She had left her siblings behind in Cleves, and letters came rarely, often filled more with political language than personal warmth. The court no longer looked to her as queen, and though she outranked nearly every woman save the king's daughters, she was not truly one of them. She existed in a strange limbo, important, yet peripheral, honored, yet forgotten, present, yet unseen. It was in this space that Anne's true tragedy took shape, not in the violence of the scaffold, but in the quiet erosion of belonging. She lived surrounded by tapestries of hunting scenes, carved oak panels, jeweled goblets, and yet none of these spoke back to her. She dined at long tables covered with white linen, and the food was rich, the wine plentiful, but the seats around her were often empty. She strolled through her gardens where roses bloomed and fountains trickled, and yet there was no one at her side to share the fragrance or the view. The solitude clung to her like a heavy cloak, invisible to the world but ever pressing upon her spirit. And still she endured with patience. Anne was not a woman of outbursts or rebellion. She did not demand, did not complain, did not conspire. She filled her days with embroidery, her hands moving steadily across fabric as she wove patterns that perhaps reflected the quiet order she longed for within. She read devotional texts, tracing the words that promised comfort in the next life, if not in this one. She managed her household with efficiency, ensuring her servants were cared for and her estates kept in order. To visitors, she seemed serene, a woman content with her lot, a noble figure who had accepted her fate with dignity. But there were moments when the mask must have slipped. In the stillness of night, when the fires had burned low and her attendants had withdrawn, she would have lain awake and felt the ache of emptiness. She was only in her 20s, still young enough to dream of children, of a husband's affection, of companionship. Yet her fate had already closed those doors. She would never be a wife again, not with the mark of Henry's rejection hanging over her. She would never cradle a child of her own, never see her lineage continue in the halls of power. She had been reduced, in the prime of her life, to a sister in name and a shadow in reality. The courtiers of England regarded her with a mixture of pity and amusement. Some respected her gentleness, others mocked her plainness, and most simply forgot her as new dramas consumed the court. Henry had remarried soon after her annulment, his passion ignited by the youthful Catherine Howard. Anne watched as the court celebrated the new queen with masks, dances, and feasts. She stood on the sidelines, smiling politely, while Catherine basked in the adoration that had been denied her. It was a cruel contrast, the discarded wife and the beloved bride, the quiet sister and the dazzling consort. Yet time has a way of shifting fortunes. When Catherine Howard was executed for adultery, Anne was present to witness the sudden reversal of the king's favor. Henry's wives seemed cursed. One divorced, one executed, one dead in childbirth, another executed still. Among them, Anne alone survived with her life and her estates intact. Some whispered that she was the luckiest of them all, that being unloved had saved her. But survival, though valuable, did not erase the loneliness of her existence. The years after the annulment stretched long. Anne grew accustomed to her peculiar position, half royal, half forgotten. She attended important ceremonies when summoned, standing with Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who treated her kindly. With Elizabeth in particular there was warmth, a bond of mutual respect. The young princess admired Anne's patience, and Anne, in turn, saw in Elizabeth the spark of a spirit that would one day transform England. These moments of connection were bright threads in the otherwise muted fabric of her life. But as the seasons turned and the years advanced, the weight of solitude grew heavier. Anne's health, never strong, began to falter. She suffered bouts of illness, fevers that left her weak, pains that lingered in her joints and belly. Physicians came with their remedies, potions of herbs and powders, but little could be done. Medicine in Tudor England offered more ritual than cure, and Anne endured her ailments with the same patience she endured her life. The body that had once been judged and rejected by a king now betrayed her in quieter, crueler ways, draining her strength bit by bit. Still, she bore herself with grace. Visitors described her as kind, gentle, even cheerful at times. She never allowed bitterness to harden her heart, never lashed out against Henry or the court that had ridiculed her. She lived simply, quietly, with dignity. Yet her gentleness was also her invisibility. The world remembered the dramatic, the executions, the scandals, the fiery personalities, and overlooked the woman who endured silently. In the grand story of Henry VIII's reign, Anne of Cleves became a footnote, a curiosity, the queen who lasted 6 months. And therein lay the cruelest irony. For while she survived, she was erased. While she lived, she was forgotten. Her survival was not triumphant, but lonely, not glorious, but gray. She existed in a liminal space, neither celebrated nor mourned, neither hated nor loved. She was Henry's sister, but never his wife. She was England's queen, but only for a season. In this, her tragedy deepened. For many of Henry's wives, death came swiftly and violently, their names etched in blood into the pages of history. Anne Boleyn's sharp rise and brutal fall became legend. Catherine Howard's youthful folly a cautionary tale. Jane Seymour was remembered for giving Henry his son, Catherine of Aragon for her defiance, Catherine Parr for her intellect and survival. But Anne of Cleves, what of her? She became the queen without a story, the woman overshadowed by her own forgettability. Yet if we pause, if we listen, her story whispers. It is not one of fiery ambition or scandal, but of endurance, of patience, of quiet sorrow. It is the story of a woman who was unwanted, but who lived, who was humiliated, but who endured, who was forgotten, but who remained. And though history overlooked her, her life speaks still, a reminder that neglect can be as cruel as violence, that invisibility can be as tragic as death. The years drifted onward, carrying Anne further from the moment when she had worn England's crown. The court no longer spoke often of her, for Henry's passions turned with the seasons, and new queens rose and fell with alarming swiftness. She, however, remained in her quiet palaces, her title of beloved sister, a curious shield against the dangers that consumed others. In that title there was both security and sorrow. She was safe because she was not loved, protected because she was unwanted. She had wealth enough, comfort enough, and the occasional warmth of royal company. Yet she existed on the periphery, always there, rarely seen. Her relationship with Henry softened after the annulment, not with affection, but with ease. He no longer regarded her with disappointment. He regarded her with indifference tempered by courtesy. At times he dined with her, laughed in her presence, even teased her gently as though she were indeed his sister rather than a discarded bride. These moments gave her a semblance of place, but they could not conceal the truth. She had been stripped of the intimacy of marriage, denied the dignity of queenship, and left with a role that existed only because it posed no threat. Yet Anne accepted it all with composure, for to protest would have been futile. It was with Henry's daughters that she found something closer to genuine connection. Mary, solemn and devout, treated her with the respect due to a former queen, and often with the kindness of a daughter toward a gentle guardian. Elizabeth, younger, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, admired Anne's patience and resilience. For Elizabeth, who had lost her mother to execution and lived much of her life in uncertainty, Anne's steady presence offered quiet reassurance. Anne, in turn, looked upon Elizabeth with affection, perhaps sensing the greatness that slumbered in the child's fierce intelligence. These small bonds did not erase her loneliness, but they gave her moments of meaning, bright threads woven into an otherwise muted fabric. As the years wore on, Anne began to feel the decline of her body. She had never been robust, and the long shadows of neglect and solitude only deepened her fragility. Illness visited her often, fevers that drained her strength, pains that lingered in her joints, a weariness that clung even when she rose from sleep. Physicians attended her with their jars of herbs and their whispered assurances, but medicine in Tudor England could do little more than delay the inevitable. She endured the discomfort with patience, never raging, never demanding, but her vitality ebbed away like water through cupped hands. Her palaces, though filled with luxury, became places of convalescence rather than joy. She walked less in the gardens, sat more by the fire, her embroidery resting often unfinished in her lap. The tapestries on the walls glowed with scenes of hunting and triumph, but they mocked her stillness. The silver plates gleamed, the goblets shone, but meals became smaller, quieter, less shared. She retreated gradually into a life of rooms dimly lit, of prayers murmured in solitude, of servants speaking in hushed voices outside her door. The grandeur of her surroundings made the contrast sharper, for the more splendid the palace, the lonelier its silence. There were occasions when she still appeared at court, but these grew rarer as her strength waned. When she did attend, she carried herself with dignity, dressed finely, her face composed. She smiled when greeted, bowed where required, and offered words of gentle courtesy. Yet she was no longer a figure of intrigue or admiration, only a polite presence, acknowledged and then forgotten amid the noise of politics and the drama of Henry's newer wives. She was a living reminder of a failed marriage, tolerated but not celebrated, respected but not remembered. And so she lived in the long twilight of invisibility. Her days slipped one into the next, marked not by triumphs or tragedies, but by the steady passing of time. She found solace where she could, in the neat stitches of embroidery, in the comfort of devotional texts, in the occasional letter that arrived from her family across the sea. But the letters came less frequently, and their words spoke more of politics than of affection. She was far from Cleves, far from the people who had once surrounded her with familiarity, and though she had been adopted into England, she was never truly of it. She belonged nowhere fully, not queen, not wife, not foreigner, not native. She existed in between, a woman without a place. The cruelest part of her fate was not illness, but irrelevance. In a court that thrived on spectacle, she had none to offer. She had not been executed in a blaze of scandal, had not died in childbirth, had not defied the king in a way that stirred legend. She had simply been unwanted, and the world forgot the unwanted quickly. Chroniclers noted her only in passing, ambassadors scarcely mentioned her, and courtiers paid her little mind. To survive was rare in Henry's court, but to survive in silence was its own kind of punishment. Still, she endured. It was the one thing Anne of Cleves did unfailingly: endure. She endured rejection, humiliation, loneliness, and illness. She endured the pitying glances of servants and the condescension of courtiers. She endured the absence of children, the absence of a husband's love, the absence of a role that gave her meaning. She endured with patience, with gentleness, with quiet strength. But endurance, though noble, cannot fill the emptiness of a heart that longs for more. As her health faltered further, the rooms around her grew quieter. Servants attended to her needs, but their whispers carried the truth that she was fading. The gardens she had once strolled became distant visions through the window. The tapestries seemed dimmer, the fire colder, the nights longer. Anne's life dwindled not in a blaze of tragedy, but in the slow dimming of vitality, the steady extinguishing of a flame that had never been allowed to burn brightly. In those final years, she must have reflected often on the strange course of her fate. She had come to England to be a queen, and she had been a queen, if only for a moment. She had been crowned, married, honored. But then she had been set aside, turned into a sister, made into a figure of politeness rather than love. She had been given houses and wealth, yet denied the warmth of family. She had survived where others perished, but survival alone is not life. She had been safe, but she had not been cherished. The tragedy of her later years was not in violence or cruelty, but in the quiet ache of invisibility. She slipped slowly from the notice of the world, and in that slipping lay the sharpest sorrow. For to die is natural, but to be forgotten while living is to die twice. Anne of Cleves carried that sorrow with her, gently, patiently, until her body could carry it no more. The final chapter of Anne of Cleves' life unfolded with the same quiet resignation that had marked so much of her journey. Illness had crept upon her for years, each season leaving her weaker than the last, and by the time she entered her early 40s, her body was tired in ways that no comfort could disguise. The servants in her households knew it, for they saw how often she remained by the fire instead of walking the gardens, how often her meals went untouched, how pale her once fair complexion had become. She spoke little of her discomfort, for she had never been one to burden others with her pain. But the truth hung in the air of her chambers. Anne was fading, and soon she would be gone. The court scarcely noticed. Henry himself was by then an aging, bloated man, beset by his own ailments, his temper as unpredictable as ever, his kingdom consumed with questions of succession and religion. His ministers schemed, his daughters prepared for uncertain futures, and his son Edward grew beneath the shadow of a father who demanded too much of him. Amid all this noise, Anne of Cleves slipped from sight, her name rarely spoken, her presence seldom remembered. She lived still, but she lived in silence, and to the court that thrived on drama, her silence was as good as absence. Yet, within her quiet seclusion, there remained flickers of dignity. Elizabeth, bright and sharp as she grew into womanhood, visited her from time to time, treating her with respect and kindness. Mary, solemn and devout, also maintained cordial affection. These gestures, though brief, gave Anne comfort in her waning days, a reminder that she was not entirely forgotten. She had no children of her own, but in those two young women she found something akin to kinship, fragile but real. It was a thread of meaning she clung to even as the rest of her life receded into shadows. Her decline was slow, and with each passing month she seemed to shrink further into herself. She spent long hours in prayer, her voice soft against the silence of her chambers, her hands folded tightly as though seeking strength from a God who had been her one constant companion. She found solace in the rhythm of familiar words, in the gentle turn of pages in her devotional texts, in the small rituals of faith that reminded her she was not alone. The faith of her childhood, simple and sincere, became her refuge. The end came in 1557, when Anne was 42 years old. It was not sudden, not violent, not the kind of death that draws gasps or stirs fear. It was a quiet slipping away, like a candle guttering at the end of its wick. She lay in her chamber, the air heavy with the scent of herbs placed there by her physicians, the curtains drawn to soften the light. Servants attended her, some holding her hand, others whispering prayers. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, her face composed. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, no public farewells. There was only the stillness of a life that had ebbed slowly into its final silence. And so Anne of Cleves, once Queen of England, passed into death as quietly as she had lived in her later years. The world did not shudder at her loss. No great mourning swept through the streets of London. Chroniclers recorded her passing with little more than a line or two, their ink barely pausing before moving on to matters they deemed more pressing. To most, she was already a forgotten figure, a queen in name only, a relic of a failed marriage. Her death was not horrific in its violence, but in its indifference, for to die unnoticed is its own cruel fate. Yet she was not left entirely without honor. Her body was carried to Westminster Abbey, the resting place of kings and queens, saints and statesmen. There, beneath the soaring arches and the hymns of the choir, she was laid to rest among the mighty. It was a strange irony. In life she had been overlooked, but in death she found a place beside those whose names echoed through history. The tomb that marked her was modest compared with the monuments of others, but it bore her name, and that name secured her place in the lineage of England's monarchy. For 6 months she had been queen, and no annulment could erase that completely. Those who stood at her funeral might have reflected, if only briefly, on the strangeness of her story. She had come to England as a bride, been crowned as a queen, then stripped of her title and turned into a sister. She had lived surrounded by wealth, but starved of love, protected by courtesy, but deprived of intimacy. She had outlived passion, scandal, and execution, surviving where others perished, yet survival itself had been a lonely sentence. She was remembered more for being unwanted than for anything she had done. And now, at last, she rested among those who had shaped England's destiny, though her own part in it had been small and muted. In the centuries that followed, her story would be told in brief, often reduced to the cruel jest of Henry's words, the memory of a disappointed king who declared he liked her not. Historians would label her the unwanted wife, the plain queen, the fortunate survivor. Her name would be overshadowed by the fiery legend of Anne Boleyn, the tragic fall of Catherine Howard, the steadfastness of Catherine of Aragon, the sacrifice of Jane Seymour, the resilience of Catherine Parr. Among Henry's 6 wives, Anne of Cleves became the faintest shadow, the one who stirred the least fascination, the one whose story seemed too quiet to tell. And yet, her story lingers, not in the clangor of scandal, but in the ache of neglect. For hers is not a tale of ambition and downfall, but of endurance and erasure. She reminds us that not all tragedies are loud. Some unfold in silence, in the slow fading of a life overlooked. Her horrific death was not in blood or spectacle, but in the indifference that surrounded it, in the way the world moved on without pausing to grieve. If we look closer, however, we find in her a quiet strength. She bore humiliation without anger, loneliness without bitterness, invisibility without despair. She endured with grace, and in that endurance lies a kind of nobility that history often fails to recognize. She was not dazzling, she was not dramatic, but she was steadfast, and that steadfastness carried her through rejection, through neglect, through the long twilight of obscurity. Her tomb still rests in Westminster Abbey, modest but enduring, a silent marker of a life both ordinary and extraordinary. Visitors pass it by, their eyes drawn to grander monuments, yet the stone remains, whispering her name to those who will listen. In that whisper lies her legacy, not the queen who captured hearts, but the queen who endured when hearts turned away. Not the queen who shaped history, but the queen who survived it. And perhaps there is something deeply human in her story, something that touches the universal fear of being forgotten. For who among us has not longed to be loved, to be seen, to be remembered? Who among us has not felt the sting of rejection, the ache of invisibility? In Anne of Cleves we see ourselves, not in crowns and jewels, but in the quiet yearning for recognition, the hope for companionship, the sorrow of solitude. Her story endures not because it is grand, but because it is tender, fragile, and profoundly human. As the centuries pass and her name is spoken less and less, each retelling gives her back a measure of what was denied. Each time we remember her, each time we tell of her gentle patience and her quiet suffering, we defy the silence that once surrounded her. We give her voice again, and in doing so, we honor not only Anne of Cleves, but all those who have lived and died unseen. So let us not remember her only as the wife Henry cast aside. Let us remember her as the woman who bore rejection with grace, who lived with dignity despite humiliation, who found strength in survival when others were destroyed. Let us speak her name not with pity, but with respect. For in her endurance, in her humanity, she left behind a story that deserves to be told, not in whispers, but in full, as it has now been told to you. And so Anne of Cleves, the quiet queen, the unwanted wife, the beloved sister, lives on, not in Henry's disdain, but in our remembrance. Her crown may have lasted only 6 months, but her story, once heard, lingers far longer, reminding us that even the forgotten have worth, and even the unseen deserve to be loved. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.